you so much for welcoming me. I first want to connect on my laptop where the slide is. Can we do it together very fast?
Yes, please. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Recording in progress.
Hello, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Okay, you've been enabled to share. Just try and share from your hand,
yes,
sir.
I'm trying to share.
Okay, then it seems there are about 2 devices. We're having an echo at the background.
Yeah, I put my phone first. I had a problem.
Oh, okay.
But now
Probably we can
I'll
use
put
one
the
of the
phone.
devices, sir. Okay, sir.
No, police.
I see you're hearing yourself. Yes, sir. Your slide is up. I can see it.
Hello? Hello?
Yes, sir. I'm with you.
I am so grateful that you are hearing me now because I had challenges in unmuting myself. Is it okay now?
Yes, very clear.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me start. Moderator?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Dr. Rio and the Secretariat of the International Association for Innovations in Educational Assessment, my dear senior colleagues in Nigeria and across Africa, and peers, our graduate students, ladies and gentlemen, I feel greatly privileged to share with you my thoughts on a topic that I consider, and which I also think you consider, very simple tonight, and that is the topic of literature review. Colleagues, if you may remember very well, this is my third time that I am delivering a lecture on the seminars. The first time, I talked about how to identify, formulate, and state a research problem. I intentionally chose that topic that I talked about because we all understand, especially when we want to help our graduate students, that the research process always begins by identifying a research problem. And my interest was to begin the seminar series lectures on the International Association for Innovation and in Educational Assessment from that very time. How do you formulate a research problem? I thought that those who are doing studies in educational assessment or any other part of education would begin to reflect on their studies and see whether they are conceiving or identifying and conceiving and stating the problem that they are researching correctly. Ordinarily, that could even be the first topic when you are studying research methodology. My second presentation was on how to formulate appropriate research objectives, questions, and hypotheses, which I also carefully thought about. I thought that if a student had learned how to identify a research problem, that same student would be helped to identify what exactly he is studying in terms of the research, the main research objectives or purpose or aim, and then the individual or specific research objectives, questions or sub-questions, and hypotheses. And I had an opportunity given by the association to make a presentation to you about this. Now, my main agenda in doing all this was that a student doing research in educational assessment could have taken opportunity to know how to identify a research problem and then how to formulate its objectives, starting from the main objective to the specific objectives. I want to confess that I was targeting specifically the graduate students in this presentation, not so much my colleagues who are supervisors. I was targeting particularly the graduate students. I wanted them to learn that when you want to conduct research, the first thing you need to do is to identify, formulate, and state an acceptable research problem. And I can tell you, I even mentioned it in my earlier presentations, that colleagues, that almost appears to be the gist of the problem. Many of our students are taking 4, 5, 6, 7, or even 8, coming to 10 years without a normal, acceptable research problem. Not only in Makerere, not only in Ugandan universities, not only in African universities, but probably across the world. That students do the coursework of their PhDs or their masters very comfortably, and then at some point, they are not able to progress. Why? Because they have not conceived, identified clearly, or formulated properly and stated accurately what their research problem is, and therefore they cannot progress. As a supervisor of these students have noticed that many times students get stuck because they are not able to follow up what they want to study appropriately. So this evening, I want to talk on an associated topic. And this topic is linked to how do you identify a research problem? If you have identified one correctly, how do you state the purpose of that study? At Makerere, the purpose of the study is the same as the aim of the study, is the same as the goal of the study, is the same as the overall objective of the study. One could even call it the agenda of the study. Although in some universities they want to break them down and start saying the general objective is different from the goal of the study, is different from the aim of the study, but we know that the purpose of the study is the same as the aim of the study, is the same as the overall objective of the study, or the main agenda of the study, what the researcher wants to achieve overall, which I talked about. I also talked about how do you then get the specific objectives. In our last lecture, in our last seminar, I talked about it. How do you then get the specific objectives? Now, this evening, as I said, I want to talk about the review of literature. And colleagues, this is a topic that does not interest many of you, and I may not be surprised if I see only 40 people in attendance, because in the other previous lectures there were 50 coming to 60 participants. Today I am only seeing 43 participants, and I'm not surprised. The reason? They say literature review is the obvious issue in research. All of us know it. All of us understand it, including senior colleagues. They say, literature review, if you're teaching literature review, that's not a big topic. But colleagues, the reason why I chose to talk about this topic are virtually two. One is that literature review is not as simple as we think. It's not. The reason why I'm saying it's not as simple as we think is, one, at Makerere, for instance, where I teach, the literature review chapter of almost every dissertation is the worst written. The worst written. I am an old student of Makerere at Masters and PhD. I know how I wrote my literature review chapters, both at Master's dissertation and PhD. I don't like to read them today. I have been teaching in Makerere for the last 10 years, and I have supervised students, over 70 masters and 11 PhDs. And I can tell you, the literature review chapter is the worst written chapters in all my students' dissertation. I love reading chapter 1. I love on introduction. I love reading chapter 3 on methodology. I even love reading the results, but not the literature review chapter. Why? Because it's normally a hopeless narration of so and so said this, so and so said this. The students do not know that the literature review chapter is a critical chapter. in their dissertations, let alone that even supervisors may not even know the value of it. The second reason why I've decided to talk about this topic is because literature review is not just a chapter in a research project or in a dissertation. No. Literature review, by its own nature, is a research methodology of its own, what we commonly call desk research method, doing research on your desk without going to the ordinary field. Now, when we look at how many of us senior academics, you can call ourselves senior academics, if we look at how many of us have ever done desk research, which is done through literature review, I can tell you even the most prolific professor may not have written 3 or 4 literature review published papers. It is as bad as that. For me, who is presenting, I've been a co-author of 2 literature review papers. One, we published it in a journal article, and the other was only a conference paper. And I can say I've been in academia at university level for the last 20 years. I can't boast of having done desk research and published more than 2 literature review papers. So that also shows you how significant the issue of literature review is. Even if we say it's the easiest topic, the most easily understood or followed up topic, it is not as easy as we think. So this evening, I want to talk about literature review in the simplest way possible, but I also want to stimulate questions and issues about this topic so that we can do some kind of self-reflection and say, I claim I know literature review, but how many literature review papers have you published, for example? Let's forget about that. Let's start the point. What is literature review? Because we all think it is the easiest. We all understand it. The point is that all of us understand the term literature review in different ways. In a study by Daniel and Harlan, they asked several different people to state what they understand about literature review. And their focus was on professionals who already were engaged in academia. And I can tell you, the 2 authors found several people defining literature review in different ways. And I want us to try to reflect on some of these ways. Somebody said, what is literature review? That literature review is a way to find out what others have done in my area of research. I want you who is listening to me to think about this. How right or how wrong or how fair or how just this particular person answering the question was. What is literature review? A literature review is the way to find out what others have done in my research. Literature review is the process of delving into current literature relating to my research topic and actively engaging and interrogating what has been done about the topic. Literature review is a critical appraisal of literature in the field I am investigating. Literature review is a summary of advanced research in my research area. Literature review is an overview and analysis of the published literature in my area of study. You know, everybody is attempting to define literature review in his or her mind. Literature review is the process of reviewing past scholarship in any area of research. Literature review is the process of analyzing what your peers in a given research field have done about that research area. Literature review is the means of keeping yourself relevant and up to date in your field of research. Literature review is an evaluation of the process of the written record of research that has been done in a particular area of research. And literature review is a critical discourse of multiple pieces of literature in a given area of research. And if I was to pose this same question to us this evening, that you say literature review is a very simple topic in research methodology, what do you understand by literature review? Most likely, some of us would either duplicate some of these questions or try to think about it. Oh, I mean, not question, rephrase some of the answers to this question or think about it in a way similar to what these earlier study respondents gave. But if you looked at it in a very organized way, what is literature review essentially to all of us? This is also not my definition. This is also a definition I just picked from somewhere. But at least it was derived from the meaning of literature review from many other scholars before us. The literature review involves the systematic identification, first, identification, remember, location of the materials that you are going to review, retrieval, analysis, and evaluation of documents containing information that are related to one's research problem, as well as an analysis of the casual observations and opinions related to one's planned study. And colleagues, I want you to forget what the other people were saying about what literature review is. I want you to start saying, what do you know literature review is about? Many of us would say it is the review of the written works of other scholars before us on the topic that we are researching. I think that makes sense. The review of the written works of the other scholars or other researchers before us on the topic that we are researching, on the problem that we are researching on. So if you believe that literature review is about that, then this summary of the fact that literature review involves, one, systematic identification of this literature, because we know literature is very rich in many topics. So being able to identify properly the literature is very critical. And I can tell you at a student level, many people fail to identify literature correctly. Many. Two, the location of this literature. At my time, when I was a graduate student, many of this literature were in libraries. They were in manual forms. So I did my graduate studies in Makerere at Masters and PhD. Many of these literature materials were not in the library at Makerere. You had to move from Makerere to the British Library in Kampala, to the Kampala City Council Library, and other places. So even ability to locate where this useful literature was, it was not easy. An ability to retrieve this literature, especially like today's scholars, you have to retrieve this literature from databases. So literature review involves the systematic identification, location, retrieval, analysis, and evaluation of documents containing information that is related to one's research study or one's research problem. And even when it comes to analysis and evaluation, what the students particularly forget is that doing a literature review indulges you in the debate about what you are researching on. It's not just about reading about what so and so said, Clark says this, no, Mukasa says this, Oro, Okafu says that. No. What do you then say? What do you say? What do you understand from this? With whom do you agree most? With whom do you disagree most? So literature review apparently is not about just analyzing what people say. It's about indulging in the debate about the knowledge in the field that you're investigating. And students rarely understand this. They think literature review is about narrating what people have said about the research problem. Not at all. Not at all. Literature review is essentially about indulging in the debate about the issues surrounding the problem. What do earlier scholars before you say? How much do you agree or disagree with them, and why? So we shall discover that in writing a literature review chapter in your dissertation or in your scholarly paper, you are actually placing yourself as a scholar among the many other scholars to show that this is what others have said or done or known, but this is what I think about this. And I can tell you, many students don't do that. Many students think that chapter on literature review is about narrating. According to so and so, this is what they say. In a study by so and so, this is what they say. No, but what do you say? What do you think about this? Who seem to be right? Who seem to be wrong? And why do you think so? That is the debate that literature review involves. And I can tell you, 90% of our graduate students do not involve themselves in that debate because they don't understand it. And I can even say, even us who supervise these graduate students, don't show them that this chapter is about the debate about this area of problem. We don't. And I can confess myself as a supervisor and even as an examiner, I've been giving marks for this chapter generously, wrongly. Wrongly in the sense that I know the candidate has not indulged himself or herself in the debate, is just narrating. And sometimes we say that there's narrative literature review, so somebody passes because of that. But this is not somebody who is showing that I have understood what the other people have said, and therefore this is my position in it or against it. Finally, when you look at this slide, literature review is not about written works only. Not at all. It also includes the analysis of the casual observations and opinions that people have expressed surrounding what you are studying. That means when you are reviewing literature, it's not only about written works. You can also bring in the opinion of people you consulted during the course of the study, during the course of understanding the problem, during the course of designing the study instrument. For example, in Uganda, if you are studying something that is related to government, and you have talked to a resident district commissioner, his opinion must go into your literature review. Or you are doing a study of something and you have talked to people who are explaining to you what that problem entails. Their opinions can even go into the conceptualization of that problem. I know students normally get bothered and start saying, how do you cite opinions of people? Some studies, particularly qualitative studies, are so complex that you don't even know how to construct the tool. And unless you talk to people before, you may not have a sensible tool. If you are studying very sensitive issues in our society, in the African society, like homosexuality, if you do not talk to some homosexuals before, you can't even know the question to ask so that you are able to get information about homosexuality in our schools. You can't. Now, in the process of consulting people in the field, including your potential study subjects, during that time, all that information can be part of your literature. So literature is not only about written works, including oral works. These are some of the things that our students sometimes do not know or do not understand. But they should begin to understand that literature review is the systematic identification, location, retrieval, analysis, and evaluation of documents, as well as casual observations and opinions arising from people in a given area of study, including casual observations and opinions, meaning that not all what we call literature is written. It may even be things which may not be written. 2, what is the main reason for conducting literature review? Even if we all say we know what literature review is, I want to say there are basically 2 reasons. The first reason for doing literature review is to help us know what is known and what is not known about the problem that we are trying to investigate. What is known is explained by those who had studied what is nearer to what we are studying. What is not known is what is not explained by the people who did not study nearer things to what we are studying. And this is probably the most important reason for doing literature review for those who are doing their PhD dissertations or master's dissertations. You do literature review so that you know what earlier researchers before you have already done and found out about the problem intriguing you or stimulating you to do a given study. But the other second and very most important reason why we do literature review is that literature review itself is a research methodology, is a research method, what we commonly call desk research or secondary research. And this is where I think I want to make a call to my senior colleagues that this is an area where we are failing as colleagues, as senior academics, that doing this research ordinarily would be cheaper than even field research, where we go to the field to collect data. Because desk research, you do it on your desk, in your university office. And apart from saying that some journals or some databases require pay before you can access it, you could actually do this research with very little cost on your part as an academic staff. Now the question is, how many of us senior professors and associate professors and other senior lecturers have ever conducted desk research and published our findings on our desk without asking for research grants from abroad or from our government or from our universities? Because that's the second purpose of literature review. Literature review is a research method. I'm going to talk about it a little bit at length at some point. But I want to say, colleagues, whether you are doing literature review to help you conduct an empirical study, or you are doing literature review as your desk research, as your primary research method, I want to say all of us as scholars know that literature review holds a very important place in the entire research process. To the extent that if you told us you did research, the next thing we can ask you is, how much review of literature did you do? Now, if you did an empirical research and you tell us that you have not done literature, I say this is bogus. Because literature review is one of the key tenets of scientific research. Any empirical study that lacks literature review is apparently hopeless. Why? Because what you claim to have been the research method could have already been dealt with ably by somebody else. You only did not read or consult literature. Or if you said you have published a literature review paper as the second part of literature review, then we said, how much literature did you review? Because you can't have a literature review paper or research without adequate review of literature in the first place. So in either way, whether you are doing literature to facilitate a new study or you are doing literature as a research method of its own, literature review takes a central place in whatever situation. That's why I'm pointing out that whether you are doing literature review to know more about what you are researching about, or you are doing literature review as a research by itself, literature review holds a critical place in the entire research process. Because all of us as scholars believe that literature review is one of the tenets of scientific investigation. My third concern would be, so if you are doing literature review to help you know how much is already known about what you are studying, or literature review as a research methodology, when do you start literature review? When do you start literature review? Or where is the position of literature review? And here I picked colleagues from a study by Daniel and Harlan, where they say that literature review begins from the development of the problem of study up to the end of the study when you are discussing findings. I even want to say I picked this from Daniel and Harlan, but it's not a very good presentation because it should have been a cycle rather than this kind of flow diagram that you start with problem development, justification, aims, and designs. It should have been a cycle, a circular presentation where when you are conducting a study, literature review should be at the very beginning. And when you are ending a study, still there must be literature review. So instead of using this flow map or flow diagram, the Harlan and Daniel should have used a cyclical presentation of a diagram where you start from at the beginning. When you're formulating your research problem, you need to review literature. When you are ending, also literature review continues. In fact, literature review begins, ends, and starts. I have a colleague who has been my office mate for some time, and he has been preaching to our students, especially the PhD, that it is literature review first and literature review throughout. And you can agree with him more, because that's what it should be. Now, in this slide, I want to say, what are the uses of literature review when you are just starting your study? What are the uses? Why should you review literature at the beginning of a research study? One, review will help you demarcate and set the broad context or field of your research. Why? Because when you are reviewing literature, you even know that this concept does not fall here or is outside here. You are studying job satisfaction and how it impacts on lecturers' research productivity. You will know that research productivity does not mean this or does not mean that when you review literature. You will know that job satisfaction does not include this concept or this dimension or the other one when you review literature. So literature review demarcates and sets the broad context of what you are researching. Literature review decides on the research topic, the narrow concepts and issues that you want to investigate. Literature review situates an existing literature in a broad and scholarly, historical, and present-day context. Literature review identifies the research gaps which you want to fill in your current study. And when you do review properly, it enhances you to become aware of the hidden issues surrounding the problem that you are investigating. Literature review helps you to become cautious of what to even expect when you collect the data. So, at the time when you are conceiving the research problem, you need to review literature and you do it thoroughly, because it will help you to understand the subject, the problem, the issues that you are trying to formulate to investigate properly. And you remember in my last lecture, I even said that one way of formulating a research problem is to identify a practical research problem where you work, in your home, in society. But I also mentioned that when you are able to identify a practical problem, for example, you are saying children from single parents do not behave well. That's your own observation as a teacher. No, that problem of single parents, children from single parents don't behave well will never stand the test of time unless you read what all the other researchers in the world have done about this problem, for you to say, yes, this problem has not been addressed well in the Nigerian context. This problem has not been done well in the Ugandan context. This problem has not been done well in the Somali context. And I want to find out if it is true. So that means before you can distinguish a given research problem and say that this is the problem I want to investigate, you must refer to literature. That justifies what my colleague says, that literature first and literature throughout. In this slide, I've shown you the reason why before you carry out a given study, you must do adequate literature review, because it will tell you the context of your study. It will tell you what should be your narrower research topic. It will tell you the gaps that exist in literature which people have not been able to address. It will tell you the hidden or sub-little things, the small things in the problem which people have not addressed, it will make you become even conscious of what to expect if you carried out that given study. But literature review does not stop at the time of conceiving a research problem, not at all. And this is very critical for the students. Here, I'm still talking about further uses of literature review when you have not gone to the field. It will help you formulate research questions. It will help you develop theoretical and conceptual frameworks. It will help you show the research methods that you are likely to use, and it will help you to avoid unintended duplication of studies. If you don't do literature review well, you are likely going to copy somebody's study. And these days, many universities are interested in checking for plagiarism, whether it is intended or unintended. They want to test whether what you are studying is original or not. So I want to urge my colleagues and our graduate students who are listening to me that at the beginning of formulating your research problem and saying, this is what I want to study for my master's or for PhD, you must do a critical literature review, so that you can say, yes, this is what I want to research into, because these are the research gaps I was able to identify. These are the research questions that I never saw earlier researchers asking and answering. And these were the methodologies that earlier researchers did not use, or probably they would get different results. When you have already started the study, do you stop literature review? I'm saying no, you don't. You can't stop literature review because you have already started the study. No, you need to continue with your literature review. Why? Because when you continue reviewing literature, when you're already in the process of reviewing literature, you gain a deeper and broader understanding of the issue that you are investigating. And this is the case for graduate students. Don't think that once your research proposal has passed the level of, for instance, in Makerere, higher degrees research, then you are through. No. You need to continue reviewing literature to be very sure that what you are doing is an addition to knowledge. What you are doing is new and novel. What you are doing is going to add something new. So you need to do some kind of literature review, even in the course that you are past the proposal stage and you're progressing with your study. 2, you need to continue reviewing literature even when your proposal has passed, because it helps you to understand people's writings about the topic or the problem you are investigating better. That's why I pointed in my slide here on point number 2 that you can now provide a better critique of the literature about the topic that you're investigating. You may even discover that the theory originally, which you pointed out that would guide your study, is not very relevant. You may discover that the importance of the study that you pointed earlier does not even hold. You might even notice that the limitations of the previous studies that you noticed does not now hold because there are new literature you've been able to come across. So, a student doing his or master's or PhD should not need to stop doing literature review at the beginning. No. Even when you are in the field, you need to continue reading. And finally, you need to continue doing literature review to refine further several elements of your study, including your research problem. Remember, sometimes you think this is a problem, and as you continue reading, you'll find that it is a problem resolved by earlier scholars before you. And I know students don't want to hear us suggesting that if you found that the problem you identified at the beginning is already resolved, why do you continue with it? Why? What's wrong with saying, colleagues or my supervisor, I found the problem identified as X is related to Y is already addressed by so and so very ably in the same context. And then you go back and plan for something else. Or you plan for refining it and redirecting it in a better way. So you can see that you cannot claim that because you review literature at the beginning, you're okay. No, you need to continue reviewing literature throughout your study, including at the time when you're conducting data collection and analysis, because you may find that what you thought was a problem is a problem resolved so many years ago. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, when you are coming towards the end of your study, you still need to review literature and review it ably. Reasons being, one, you cannot discuss your research findings without literature. And this is where we have problems. You can finish a whole master's and PhD program without knowing what a discussion is. Can you imagine? But a discussion is a corroboration of your findings with that of earlier scholars before you. It is a process of positioning your findings in line with what is already established by earlier scholars before you. Now, if you do not know what has been done by other scholars before you, in short, you can't do a discussion. And this is what students rarely understand. They rarely understand this. They don't know what a discussion involves. They just know, write a discussion chapter, and they think they will just go about it like that. And maybe the good thing or the bad thing is that we supervisors don't also care about this. And many times when you go to the discussion section, you'll find students have not really done a thorough discussion of their own findings. But there is no up-to-date discussion without adequate knowledge of literature. There's no discussion without that. Discussion means positioning your findings in line with what is known before you. Can you imagine? Two, you may not even have the opportunity to have new ways to interpret your findings without proper literature review. You may not be able to resolve conflicts between what you have found and what earlier scholars have identified. And if you did a good literature review, you know the earlier theories that people have used, you know the earlier conceptual frameworks that people have used, and so on. You can emerge with a modified or improved theoretical or even conceptual frameworks. You can't do this without literature review. If, as a PhD student, you are being asked to demonstrate anything new, and that's normally a common question they normally ask many PhD students, what is new in your study? You can't talk about what is new in your study if you don't know what is known earlier. So, colleagues, I want to say that literature review is an important element of research from the very beginning to the end, and to the beginning again. And to the beginning again. At every stage, whether you are still planning the study, or whether you're already executing the study, or whether you're already concluding the study, you need a thorough knowledge of literature before you, so that you are able to situate yourself as a scholar right from the beginning into the middle and at the end of the study that you are doing. Maybe the question you may be asking me, where do I get literature from? And what are put here as sources of literature? Let me go a little bit faster now. The other parts were the most important to me. There are preliminary sources of literature where you get pointers to where you can get literature from. We call them preliminary sources of literature. A table of content for a book, a table of content for a journal. Some journals actually, even the paid app journal, send you table of content. They want you to see it so that you can pay to enter their journals, to see the topics that you are interested in. Those are preliminary sources. Abstracts, indices at the end of a book, abstracts for the journals, abstracts for conference papers. These are very good pointers to the actual literature that you want to go into. We call them preliminary sources. Then the primary sources, the sources where people with first-hand information have published their works. Like, for example, in a journal where researchers have published their work, in a conference paper where researchers are presenting their research ideas. These are primary sources. And I want to say this. There are also secondary sources where people have commented or talked about the primary sources. Okay? There are very many instances when you find a commentary. For example, a literature review article is actually a secondary source. A desk research produces a secondary source of literature. Now, somebody would ask, which is more important? I want to suggest that researchers should focus on primary sources more because that's where original ideas, results, and views about a given topic has been presented. Tertiary sources include all these other three sources. They may have a table of content, they still have primary results, and they have secondary results. So we could call them tertiary sources of literature. But a very critical part, which again, graduate students ignore, is that even personal consultation can produce you a source of literature. A talk with the resident district commissioner, a talk with the district education officer, a talk with the head teacher of a school on the topic that is of interest to you, a talk with the vice chancellor of a university. That is still literature. Can you imagine? That is still literature. We call it personal networking. It is still literature. And I know people will say, how do I reference this? How do I cite this in my work? A talk with the DEO, a talk with the resident district commissioner, a talk with the minister of education. The APA, for example, the APA format, which we normally follow in many universities in Africa, gives you guidelines on how to cite oral conversation or oral communication. And sometimes students do not know this. Lastly, we can talk of sources of literature in terms of manual publications, where you get a manually written journal, a manually written report, a manually written textbook or something, and then you read it. But many times these days, we depend on electronic literature. Electronic literature. So I want to talk about manual literature and electronic literature. And I can tell you this, we have seen that our younger students are very good at accessing electronic literature in databases of different kinds. Sometimes they get literature which we older academics cannot get. So, since my focus is on the graduate students, please, I want to encourage you to learn how to access electronic literature. Because that's what we scholars in Africa are depending on. We are no longer depending on manual journals. A hard copy of a journal, if you went to Makerere Library, you won't get many. You'll get a few. You'll get a few. You cannot get many textbooks, physical printed textbooks in the Makerere University Library. They're there, but if you get them, they're old ones. New ones, no. So we need to talk about sources of literature in terms of manual publications and also electronic publications. And I want to encourage each one of us to learn how to access these electronic publications. Now, how do you do a literature review? And colleagues, I want to say almost every scholar has advice on how to do this. And if you look at people's writings, you'll find that several people have given different pieces of advice how you can do literature review, whether manually or electronically. But here I picked just the 7-step approach of how to do literature review. It's not that it's the best, but at least gives you the clue on how do you go about reviewing literature. One, define your research question. Because research is about attempting to answer some questions that you have, which you are not able to get answers to. So what is that question you are trying to answer? Define that clearly because it will help you in the review of literature that you must look for. Two, decide on the scope of your review of literature. Now, when you are defining on your review of literature, you have to think about the time scope. From which time to which time? You have to think about your geographical scope. From which region or which place to another place? It's good to think about the scope. And sometimes, like these days, you can even think about the databases because literature available on a topic are kept in many databases. So on which database are you going to look for this literature? You need to think about it much earlier. So you don't think about time only, or about place only, or about topic only, or question only. You have to think about several things for you to define the scope of your review. Three, you have to select the databases from which you want to conduct the review. That's if you're going to do it electronically. But even if you are doing it manually, which journals are you going to read? Which textbooks are you going to read? Which reports are you going to read to be able to find out more about the problem that you are researching about? Then, in step 4, you now need to conduct the searches and find the literature. If you have already identified the databases, the time period of your review, and the kind of studies you want to study to review, then you need to proceed to review the literature. Step 5, review the literature. And this is where, colleagues, I can tell you, graduate students don't do well. I told you at the beginning that I've supervised at Makerere University alone at least 70 master students and 11 PhD students to graduation. So I can say from my own experience, I have gone through a bit of challenges with these students. One thing I noticed that I can tell you is that I noticed some people review literature, but they don't review it well. They don't understand it. They don't summarize the points they know from this literature appropriately. They cannot interpret the findings from these studies they are reviewing. And that is very challenging. Some people who are listening to me may not believe this, that sometimes you read an article and you actually don't understand it. And yet you have reviewed it. And sometimes you may even want to make use of it. And so sometimes people make use of the literature they review either haphazardly or halfway, or sometime in a way you can challenge. So, step 5, review the literature. And when you are reviewing it, you need to attempt to understand what it is. That was for a conference in India sometime in 2014. And an editor of a journal said, for him, as an editor, he does not publish articles which are straightforward, which he or she just reads once and has understood everything, and so it doesn't. That is beyond that level. Now, what does this mean? What it means is that there are some articles which are published that we review that are not easy to understand. They are difficult to understand. Now, I want to say, when you are reviewing literature, you are likely going to get this kind of articles. You need to be able to do some kind of analysis and synthesis of the literature that you do. Now, what is analysis? Ordinarily, we know the word analysis is about showing breakdowns of how something is made up of. So if you are reading something about job satisfaction, or you are reading something about staff retention, or you are reading something about assessment in universities, are you able to see similarities, break down to see that these 4 things are the same, these 3 things are different? Are you able to see that? 2, are you able to see, okay, I talked about similarities, but are you able to see differences? That this is different from that. Okay, these 2 people say this, and these 3 people say that. Now, the ability to break down ideas into component parts is analysis. The ability to bring similar ideas together is called synthesis. And I can tell you, many of us face a lot of challenges in doing this analysis and synthesis. When you go to the literature review chapter of many students' work, you'll find, according to so-and-so, according to so-and-so, according to so. A student who does not say, according to 2, 3 people, does not have analytical skills. Because if you have analytical skills, you would see similarities. You see similarities. You see differences. So analytical skills are very important when you're reviewing literature. And in the last step, we need ability to write the literature. And this is why I told you at Makerere, if you picked any dissertation and you read the literature review chapter, you'll definitely get discouraged reading the entire dissertation. Many of us, me, one of them, wrote it badly. And I see many of our students after me also still continuing to write it badly. Writing the literature review is a very critical section in the review of literature. And I want my senior colleagues to reflect on what they wrote in their dissertations and also sometimes in their current papers. How good is the literature review section that we are writing? I want to say, when you are doing the literature review, there's a need to capture the information that you get from it. And here, in Daniel and Harlan, they give us a template for capturing that information. That you can try to see, if you make such a table, a template like this, you have a column of elements to be reviewed. Like you want to find out for every literature or a paper you review, what is or was the aims or objectives or general objectives of that study? What were the key research problems that the researcher addressed? What method did the researcher use? What theory did the researcher apply? What conclusion? Okay, fine. Before even conclusion, think about what were the key findings of that researcher or researchers. What were their conclusions? What were their limitations? And what were the recommendations, if any? Now, remember, in a study for a PhD, we are expecting about 200 articles read from different sources. For a master's, maybe about 100. So how do you make use of all those several sources of literature? Daniel and Harlan gives us a template like this for identifying the different articles. Now, after getting for the individual articles, then you need to make some kind of a summary, a synthesis of those articles. You may find you have reviewed for your master's dissertation 100 articles, but 7 of them talk about the same thing. 18 of them talk about the other thing, 24 of them talk about the other thing, 22 of them talk about that. So you need to get some kind of synthesis of the things that you have been able to review. And I want to say many students do not go this far. They just review literature and start to write. According to so-and-so, this is this. According to so-and-so. And we are expecting more than according to so-and-so. I have a senior colleague, a Professor Musazi, who normally talks about so-and-so talk about this. So what? They are entitled to talk about those things. So I want our graduate students who are reviewing literature to think, how are they reviewing literature? And how are they going to synthesize that literature so that they're able to say, these people have similar opinions on this issue, but these people have different opinions on this issue. And for me, I think like this, because I told you that literature review is indulging in the debate. So you can't avoid yourself having an opinion over the matters that these other people are saying. When you are writing literature review, there are two common approaches to writing it. And I see sometimes master students or even graduate or PhD students in the same class writing them in different ways. It is allowed. It is allowed. But remember, the commonest method for writing literature review are two. One, we call it the thematic approach, where when you go to your literature review section, you identify the main issues, the main themes, the main topics that you want to write about. You are studying the effect of management on educational assessment. Then you talk about educational management. What is educational management? And you review issues about it. Then you talk about another topic would be educational assessment, what it involves. Now, that is called thematic approach to literature review. The advantage is that it helps you to talk about the key issues in the research area that you are studying, okay? But the disadvantage is that it doesn't link what you are reviewing to the specific research issues or problems that you are dealing with. And like at Makerere, we no longer follow that format. We did it in the past. We now don't follow the thematic approach to literature review. What we follow now is called the objective by objective approach to literature review, where when you are reviewing literature and you have two objectives, we expect you to review literature on those two objectives to find out scholars before you who studied something very near to what you are studying now, according to your objectives. So that means if a student has 7 objectives, we are expecting 7 subheadings of review of literature in accordance with that, with those research objectives. That is the approach we are following now. That's the approach we are following now. And it is very challenging. That means if a student by some bad luck had 11 objectives, then that means literature review is going to be broad and challenging. We shall expect 11 subheadings according to those objectives that you are trying to study. What are you trying to do? To find out the scholars before you, what they did near what you studied, and what they said, and what they did not do, and what methodology they use, and all that. So we call that objective by objective review of literature. And that's at Makerere what we follow. I know elsewhere you may be still following maybe the thematic approach or another approach, but those are the two approaches. Remember, when you are doing literature review, you need to be very careful. That's why I told you, everybody, when you start telling, I'm going to teach about literature review, say, that's an obvious thing. Literature review is obvious. But the truth is, almost none of us do a good literature review. Almost none of us. Let alone that even the scholars who have been in the university service and their professors for years, rarely would you find their publications of literature review papers in accredited publication fora. Like there are some journals that publish strictly literature review papers. But you don't find many professors that have sat down on the desk, reviewed literature, and they have been able to publish good literature review papers. You hardly find that. If you found them, they are normally from developed countries and Europe because they have the time to read and be able to publish literature. So it's not as easy as we think. Okay, I've talked about examples of how to publish literature here, but these are just sample examples. You can do it in a narrative form, you can do it in an analytical form, but many times we appreciate analytical literature review where the scholar is able to indulge in the debate, agree with some side, disagree with some side, show shortcomings of other literature, and so on. That's what we are more interested. We are not interested in narrative literature. Because according to so and so, this is what according to so and so. So somebody would say, Musazi would say, so what? If so and so said this, so and so said this, so what? Okay. At the end, a good literature review must be focused on the problem you are investigating. Preferably, should be very linked to the objectives that you are researching onto. It should be extensive in coverage in terms of time, from the probably the oldest to the newest time. It should be extensive in terms of geographical coverage, from Latin America to Asia to from America to Europe and Africa, it should be critical in analysis. You should be able to downplay the importance of those findings. That is when it creates opportunity for you to defend what you are trying to study. It should be analytical. Show the breakdowns of things which are related, things which are different. It should be up to date in terms of time. It should be logical in presentation. And these are the challenges. When you read the literature review chapter for many people, you'll find things which happen in the early 1900s or 1920s are being brought after somebody has talked about the things that happened in the 1940s. That is not logical way of bringing ideas. At least there must be sequence in the way your thoughts are presented. So you need some logical presentation. Should be well structured. Okay, like in our case in Makerere, we want literature review to be by objectives. You have 7 objectives, we expect 7 headings. Okay, we expect 7 headings. You have 6 objectives, we expect 6 headings of literature review. And sometimes students don't follow that. And yet that's what we instruct the external examiners to know, to follow. So some students have actually been let down merely on the literature review chapter. Literature review chapter. And somebody, how do you fail a dissertation on literature review chapter? But because you're not following the university structure. And maybe lastly, how you write it is very critical. The language, the grammar, and like I would suggest that we need to get some softwares to help us strengthen the way we write. I can tell you, like at Makerere, the writing is always very bad, that you won't wish to read a 30 pages of literature review of someone who has not thought about what he's writing, structured it in the correct way, and is logically thinking about every sentence that he or she is saying. Lastly, colleagues, on the first part of my presentation, I want to talk about that there are many types of literature reviews that you can read and also write. When you are doing your study and you want to know more about what has been done, remember that's the first purpose of literature review. You can review conceptual papers. Conceptual papers are those papers where scholars have explained the meaning of the concepts that you are studying. They are very helpful for understanding. If you're talking about job satisfaction, you're talking about research productivity, you're talking about assessment for learning, you're talking every topic you're thinking about. You need to get the right meanings of what people refer to these concepts about in conceptual papers. While you can read conceptual papers, you can actually also produce conceptual papers. As a student, as an academic, as a scholar, you can actually also produce constitutional papers. What will that paper be about? A paper attempting to understand or explain the meaning of the concepts or concept. Like I have a student I've been helping on graduate employability. Now, this student must review literature on what is graduate employability. When did this word, for instance, come into being? What did it mean at that time? What does it now mean? Who are the people who have talked about it? What did they mean by it? So that helps the student to say, in my study, this is what this concept will then mean. You can't know that if you don't review conceptual papers. 2, they are theoretical papers. Papers that talk about the theory of about something, like the theory of graduate employability. Quite a number of people have given theories and models that explain how effective graduate employability can be achieved. You need to review them. Then there are empirical reviews, papers that review practical studies that have been done in a given field. We can call them empirical reviews because they are reviewing studies that have practical results from the field. Then there are methodological reviews. There are some papers that have discussed methods of study in a given area of research. And you may be interested in somebody who used a case study, somebody who used an ethnography, somebody who used a survey, somebody who used clinical trials, whatever method that they've used to study something, you may be interested. And you may even be interested in finding out, do these methods result into the same findings or not, and so on. So you can read a paper, which you call a methodological review, or even produce a paper by yourself, which you can call a methodological reviews. You can do historical reviews, a study of something from an historical perspective. Okay? You can do this on policy studies. You may be interested in assessment policies over the years in Uganda, and you may be interested in how was it in the 1920s, how was it in the 1950s, and how is it today in the 2020s. You know, you can do systematic reviews. Actually, this is the commonest type of literature review, where somebody does a review following strict set rules for conducting the review. Then we call it a systematic review. Unfortunately, when you read some people's systematic review, you find that they were never systematic. What makes a review systematic is because how the literature was identified, how the literature was analyzed, the data was analyzed, and all that were premised on some specific prior set rules and regulations. So a PhD student can actually do a systematic review of literature in his or her study area. And that's what, for instance, in Makerere, they would expect a PhD student to do, to publish a literature review before even collecting the empirical data. But students do not understand this. The supervisors do not support the students in this. So many students wait for their empirical results before they are able to publish a scientific paper. There's a literature review called a meta-analysis. This is a kind of systematic review, but where somebody reviews several studies in a given area over a period of time and ends up analyzing the results quantitatively. Quantitatively, not qualitatively, quantitatively. So if you decide, for instance, to review literature on educational assessment in Uganda in secondary schools since 1920 to date, and you want to find out all the studies that have taken place in it, and you want to end up saying 80% of the studies have been this, 20% of studies have been on this, 14% of this, you want to analyze the results of all these studies over a long period of time quantitatively. That is a meta-analysis. Some scholars call it an integrative review. an integrative review. A meta-analysis can be referred to also sometimes as an integrative review. But why does it become integrative? Because you are studying very many people's studies in the same topic, same field for a long period of time, and you are trying to see the pattern emerging out of the findings, out of the methodology, out of whatever that has been studied in that field. We call it a meta-analysis. And I can tell you, very few African scholars have done meta-analysis. Very few. Very few. Very few of us have done it. Because we don't want to sacrifice a lot of time to study literature in a given field for a long period of time to see what is emerging from what those studies have brought out. We don't want to do that. Integrating their methodology, their objectives, and their findings and their conclusions, and we don't want to do that. Our European brothers do that very heavily. Then there are scoping reviews, where the reviewer seeks to provide an original indication of the current and future scale of the literature in a given sector. That's why we call it scoping. Like you might have noticed that in Uganda there is violence in schools, and you want to find out people who have done studies on violence against children in schools in Uganda, what we call VACs, and you want to do a scoping review. A scoping review means you define the scope in terms of time and geographical area, and you want to find out what has been studied about it. That means if you are doing a scoping review on Uganda, violence against children in Uganda, you don't do the review against studies outside Uganda. The scoping is in terms of geography, time, geography and time, and maybe the topic, the subject that you are reviewing literature on. Then there's a critical review. This is a review that where the person is trying to punch holes in the works of all earlier scholars before him or her in a given research area, in a given research topic. We call it a critical review. And lastly, I pointed out here the state-of-the-art review, where somebody is interested in reviewing literature on the current research area, a given topic, and so on. Then you can call his review a state-of-the-art review, because he's trying to review the latest literature on a topic or a problem that is interested in, and can baptize his literature review and say, this is a state-of-the-art literature review, because he's talking about the current affairs, maybe the last decade, what is being said about what he's trying to study. Ladies and gentlemen, I have not given all the types of literature review, because people can baptize it in their different ways of doing it. But I've talked about literature review of different forms, which you can consult, which you can also produce. You can also produce. Now, the question I may want to ask, especially my senior colleagues, is what type of literature review have you been able to publish? A methodological review, a narrative review, an integrative review, a meta-analysis, a state-of-the-art review. On what topic? These are the things that we need to continue reflecting about, because sometimes we may think literature review is a very simple business, but it's not. Finally, colleagues, I want to wind up in a very fast way. That literature review is not just knowing what is known or unknown about the topic you are studying. Literature review by itself is a research method, is a way of study. We call it normally desk study. And that's why I'm saying, I'm challenging ourselves, especially senior colleagues, that we need to do more desk study. Why? Because it's a bit like cheaper financially. Sometimes you may not need to get a research grant in order to do a desk study, a desk research, or a literature review study. You don't need so much money. Of course, you may need money because some journals are paid for journals. Okay, but you can also do a literature review study for those free to access journals, for those free to access other sources of literature. This is where we could publish with minimum cost, probably only maximum time, because we need time to read the literature before we can publish. Now, in case you are using literature review as a research methodology, as a desk research or a secondary research, how do you go about it? I want to say the process of conducting a literature review study is not any different from the other field research. They are not any different. First, you have to review literature so that you can indulge in the discourses surrounding the debate. You don't review literature on a field which is already heavily researched into. You must first be able to identify research gaps in that field before you can do a depth research in it. You do literature review to broaden your understanding of the topic, to see whether earlier scholars before you have not addressed it appropriately. You do literature review to obtain information that can inform practice. And some people do literature review for that. You read widely about some topic so that you're able to see what can inform the current practice.